Hey MCARBO Brotherhood, really excited to introduce our two best products for the Savage 64. Now, real quick, I want to point out these products will also work in the other variations of the Savage 64. So the Savage Stevens 62, the Cooey 64, the Lakefield 64 Bravo, the Savage 954, and all other variations of the Savage 64. Every one of these firearms, these parts are going to work for. So the biggest benefit we've got here is we've got a trigger spring kit that's got a custom sear spring and a custom trigger return spring that's designed to reduce your trigger pull weight, making your firearm much more accurate and precise. And with these firearms, they're $100 to $140 off the shelf. They're great, but they've got a few things missing. They could have a better trigger pull for one and a better trigger for two. These pot metal triggers have been known to break, believe it or not. We were completely surprised when we were getting an email request asking for a trigger, and when we asked back saying why, they said, well, mine broke. I've got to find a replacement. So I get it. We can't have triggers that are actually breaking. We've got an aluminum 6061 aircraft grade machined target trigger for the Savage 64. You'll see here it's got a nice smooth blade. You'll notice on the actual factory trigger there's all these pits in the metal. It's just a casted pot metal part. It's just hard to get that nice precision uniform feeling throughout it. So with this nice trigger here, the MCARBO trigger is going to have that nice smooth crisp comfortable trigger. We're going to go into that, and as a bonus we're also going to show you a quick little extra disassembly of the Savage and go into some cleaning ideas and how to properly clean this efficiently. Before we begin, let's check our rifles, make sure they're clear. Check the chamber, check the bolt face, and check the magazine well. This firearm's clear. Now let's check our factory trigger pull before we get started, but since we are going to be dry firing, we want to make sure we're inserting a snap cap, which is a dummy round, into the chamber. Because it is a rimfire rifle, it will strike the actual steel chamber there, damaging the firing pin. The way these operate, just in case this is your first rimfire, is that it'll actually, the firing pin will strike the rim of the cartridge where the primer is. So if there's no cartridge in the firearm, it'll instead strike the steel chamber, further damaging the firing pin, which will eventually lead to light strikes. So in order to avoid any excess damage on our rimfire rifles, we're going to use a snap cap to make sure we avoid that. Now let's see what our factory trigger pull is. 4 pounds, 11.3 ounces. Now let's go ahead and take a second factory trigger pull reading just to confirm. Looks like we're averaging about a 4.5 pound trigger pull on this one. We did buy this firearm used for a heck of a deal, 80 bucks. That's part of the reason why we're going to go into a further disassembly and cleaning, just to make sure we know what we've got sitting here and further protect our investment. But 80 bucks for this firearm, you just can't beat it. So I will say that it's likely that the trigger pull might be a little less than what you get off the factory shelf. I think it would be about 5.5 pound trigger. Go ahead and comment in the section below if you guys have a factory Savage 64 or any other variations I mentioned previously, and tell me what you got for a stock trigger pull. 4 pounds, 8 ounces. So yeah, we're right there, 4.5 on this used Savage 64. I'm really excited to see what we can get it down to when we put the springs in and the new trigger. All right guys, let's go forward. Parts and tools needed for this build: Savage 64 trigger spring kit with a custom sear spring, custom trigger return spring by MCARBO. Savage 64 target trigger, 6061 aircraft grade aluminum by MCARBO, a 1/16 inch punch, 3/32 inch punch, Phillips head screwdriver, flathead screwdriver, a hammer, a 5/32 Allen key, a 7/16 wrench, a block of wood with a 1/2 inch hole in it, and as always guys, make sure you're wearing iPro. Go ahead and take your 5/32 Allen key. We're going to remove these two stock assembly bolts here. These two bolts are universal, so it's not a big deal if you get them messed up, but it'd be ideal if you remember which one goes either in the rear or the front. So if you can, keep them separated. All right, go ahead and separate the stock from the receiver and barrel. So this is that really unique design that I was talking about initially. You can see how everything is compartmentalized. You've got your trigger assembly here, and it's bolted on here. You've got your magazine housing just bolted on here. Your actual bolt is up here in the receiver, which is completely captured here. In order to get into the receiver, you've got to remove the barrel. So there's a barrel clamp here with this stud that comes off and it actually removes the whole barrel. So it's a really interesting design. Plus, once we jump in here, you'll see how the bolt and the hammer is all compartmentalized into one complete unit. Really unique. You'll see it. The hammer looks nothing like you typically see in your traditional .22 rifle, like your Marlin or anything like that. So it's interesting how it's all bolt-on, compartmentalized design. I guess it's good. I guess it is quite a novel idea. Bit of a more pain to remove everything just to clean the inside of the receiver and the bolt. All right, we're gonna go ahead and start. We're gonna remove our trigger assembly and our magazine housing. Now just take notice, this is where the actual stock assembly screws thread in. So just an FYI, you can see how simple it is. If you were to change out the stock, it's just a matter of those two bolts like you saw previously. So grab your Phillips head screwdriver. We're gonna remove this magazine housing screw up front here first. Got the little lock washer on it as well. Go ahead and set that aside. Grab your flathead screwdriver. We're gonna remove this stock assembly stud here. See, that just comes right out with the lock washer. Keep those together. You see it starts already moving around here. Now we're going to remove our rear stud here, and that'll pull the whole assemblies out. Now you'll hear that. That's the hammer going forward because it was cocked. Okay. Now go ahead and pull out magazine housing assembly. Set that aside. Now your trigger assembly. This is what we're going to be working with. Go ahead and set your receiver and barrel aside as well. So don't let that surprise you. Your hammer is going to go flying forward when we remove these components. Now we're going to go ahead and install the MCARBO trigger spring kit. Go ahead and get that out. So this is your sear spring here. This is your trigger return spring here. You'll notice on the MCARBO spring, it's actually even on both ends. You'll see here the factory trigger return spring is a little different. I'll show you that first. Grab your small punch, and we're gonna actually just grab one of the coils and compress it and pop it right out. Get your thumb over it so you don't lose it. So it's the trigger return spring here. You can see how it's a little more narrow on this end and a little wider on this end. Go ahead and set that aside, not a big deal. Now we'll take our MCARBO spring, trigger return spring, set it in like so. Basically want to get it on that little tab there. All right, see how it compresses between these two tabs. And it just pops right in. Now take your small punch and get it on there. Make sure it's completely captured on this tab and this tab. All right. Good. Now we're going to go ahead and get the sear spring out. All right, so to get the sear spring out, all we need to do is remove one of these E-clips. We're going to remove this one right here, and just pay attention to how the sear is actually in there as we remove it. It's always helpful to be observant how everything locates and interacts with one another. All right, so let's go ahead and remove this E-clip. This block of wood here just kind of helps assist. Take your flathead and just get it started, and you'll see it start to kind of creep off. You'll see how that big E-clip's moved a little. Now I take my 1/16 inch punch and I just pull it off, just pry it a little bit. Comes right off. Set that aside. Go ahead and press down on the sear. Kind of push it out. That pin, take your larger punch. Press that pin right out. Set that pin aside for a second. Now we'll go ahead and slowly remove our punch, and we're going to take a look at how it all comes out. So you'll see how the sear interacts with everything. So when we put it back in, we want the sear to go in like so. See that little tooth right there? That's going to be down and forward. Set that down. You can see how the sear spring sits in there as well. We're just going to replicate the same thing. Go ahead and set that factory spring aside. Grab your MCARBO spring. Compress it. Set it in there. It's going to be a matter of lining those holes up here in a second. Go ahead and grab our sear and set it in there, just like so. Now you're going to have to get that little leg in there, so it's going to require you to push it forward a little bit to get it completely captured in the housing. Now it's going to be a matter of lining up these holes. So we'll take our 1/16 inch punch, line up the holes. Now we're going to go ahead and take our pin with that E-clip still on it, and we're going to press it through. We're using that punch as a guide to help make sure we get that pin in there, keep everything lined up in the process. And it is helpful too to just press down and then use your punch to kind of get everything lined up, control the process. There you go. Now let's put that other E-clip on. See, that was easy. Just make sure that E-clip's all the way on there. Good to go. Awesome. Got our spring kit in. That was fast, simple. Now while we're at it, let's put a new trigger on there. Now let's go ahead and bust out our Savage 64 target trigger. Machined 6061 aircraft grade aluminum. Beautiful. Let's put this baby in. You can see a quick comparison side by side how they differ. You can see those little pits there in the pot metal trigger. Definite noticeable difference between just the texture and the feel of each trigger. The aluminum trigger is so much smoother, nicer. This pot metal trigger is kind of slippery too, actually. It's got those pits in it. Let's go ahead and jump in and put this thing in. So we'll start by removing this pin back here. Okay, this is the safety retaining pin. And then we're going to go ahead and pull this actual safety selector switch off, and you'll see there's a detent under here and a spring, and there's another pin right here that we're going to remove. So let's go ahead and start the process. Take your flathead screwdriver, just remove this pin, this retaining pin. Pops right off. Set that aside. Okay. Go ahead and flip it over. You can see how the safety is going to want to just fall right off almost. All right. You can see comes right out, the safety. Okay. You can see that detent right here, and there's a spring behind it. So what we want to do is get the detent and the spring to come out. All right. You can see how they'll go back together just like that. All right. Set that aside. Now we've got this pin here in the top of the trigger. Okay, that's how it's captured in there. That's how it's held. There's two pins. So with this pin, it's actually, there's a little bit of interference there intentionally from the factory so that it doesn't fall out. So you've got to wiggle the trigger a little bit to pull this pin out. Makes it a lot easier. All right, so we got that pin out. Now we need to remove the E-clip. Go ahead and take your flathead screwdriver and remove the E-clip. Usually it's helpful just to get it started with the screwdriver, then take your little 1/16 inch punch to do the rest. And that way there you don't lose it either, because these E-clips will fly on you. I mean, that is probably what, it's almost what they were designed to do when you're removing them. It's just crazy. All right, so now we'll go ahead and remove that pin, okay? Now, the trigger will just fall right out. But I want to show you how it goes in there. So you can see how there's that tab here and how it locates inside the assembly, all right? And you can see too, when you hold it up, you got to have that trigger just right for that top hole to line up. And you can see how they have that interference in there. So that's why you got to move the trigger a little bit to get that top pin out. But that's it. Just want to do a real quick side-by-side comparison of the two. You can see now that this factory trigger's out. You can see all those little pit marks in there. It's real kind of grainy and pitty and slippery too. It's not right. You know, this trigger breaks. I just can't believe it. And it took us enough requests to finally get us to make a trigger to replace it. But you'll see amongst the forums and such, you'll see that it's breaking here predominantly. It's just this thin little wall of pot metal, and because it is a hinge point in the trigger, the pins do go through there. There is some stress involved on this little wall here, and it actually breaks. So if that breaks, your trigger is now inoperable. So to correct that, we've got a 6061 aircraft grade aluminum trigger, hard black coat anodized for superior strength and durability. Let's go ahead and put that in right now. Just a matter of reversing the process. So go ahead and we'll slide the trigger into the trigger assembly in that little notch there. All right. Then we'll take our pin with the E-clip on it, set that on the bottom, put some downward pressure on it, pushes the pin right through. Take our E-clip, set it right on there. Take our flathead screwdriver, drive it home, make sure it's fully seated. Okay. Now we've got to line up that top hole and get that pin in there. You'll notice this pin is actually tapered. It's bigger up here, more narrow down here. So I'm going to insert the narrow end. Really want to make sure this pin's fully seated. You'll feel it go in, but most importantly, you'll see it operating. You'll see it moving both the trigger and this bar here. So it's one complete piece now. So the trigger and the trigger bar have to move together. Okay? Now we're going to go ahead and reinstall the safety. You need the safety selector, the spring and detent, and the actual retaining clip for the safety. So we'll start by putting the spring and detent back in place. It goes in this hole here. So make sure you got the spring and detent on there and drop it right in. Okay. Now take the safety selector switch. All right, we're going to go ahead and drop it in this hole, this pin, and you want to actually compress it onto the detent, like so. You'll see the detent right there in that top hole. Okay. Now you want to make sure you get that pin all the way through, so you may have to kind of help assist it all the way through to the other side. There's going to be some tension on it. Helps if you can just use your punch to push it through. Okay. See how it's all the way through on the other side now? Now we'll take the retaining clip and slide it right on. Make sure it's fully seated. Grab your flathead screwdriver, completely press it on. Go ahead and test it, make sure it functions. Good to go. Now that we've got our 6061 billet aluminum trigger in place and our trigger spring kit to reduce trigger pull installed, we're going to go ahead and reinsert everything back into the firearm. But before we do that, I want to do the quick bonus edition of this video and just show you how the rest of the disassembly goes and a quick little cleaning overview. Then we'll put it all back in. So let's go ahead and set the trigger assembly aside, magazine housing aside, go ahead and grab your receiver and barrel group. Now let's start the rest of the disassembly. We want to remove this stud here and the barrel clamp. That'll actually pull the barrel right off, give us access to the receiver, the bolt, and everything else. And we can take a better look at what we've got and clean the firearm. So we're removing this stud here. That was your 7/16 inch wrench. Stud comes off, and then the barrel clamp comes off. Then the barrel comes right out. Okay, now you'll see your ejector right here. It'll be sitting on this side of the barrel. Now your charging handle will come right out, and that bolt will slide right out of the receiver. Look at that. That was the firing pin. But look at the receiver. Isn't that something? I mean, it looks great. Actually, it's really nicely machined. Now here's your firing pin here. The firing pin just sits in the top of the bolt here, and that track. Be a good idea to make sure that's nice and clean. No carbon buildup or anything like that. You've got your extractor right here. Your ejector's down here. Now you see you've got your hammer here. So isn't that interesting? And your hammer spring. Your hammer just rides on this guide here with the hammer spring encased. And that's what sends that firing pin flying forward. Pretty interesting, that whole design. I mean, you rarely ever see a hammer like this. Pretty cool. So we'll go ahead and clean this up a little bit. There's some surface rust on this bolt. Show you a few things that I would recommend cleaning, and we'll put it all back together. So since we've got our firearm all disassembled completely, and this installation, it kind of just makes sense to do it. If you're gonna go ahead and put these parts in, why not do a deep cleaning? Just go through some quick stuff here on the cleaning aspect. Got some CLP, got bore snake, which is 223/556 caliber bore snake, but it'll work for the 22. So if you got one of these, highly recommend these rather than using the steel rods. Those steel rods can really screw up the rifling in the barrel. These bore snakes are cheap, they're easy, and they do a great job. If you got some brushes, this is handy. You've got a brass tipped brush here, stainless steel tipped brush here, and a nylon tipped brush. You can get these anywhere. These are really helpful. Obviously a rag, just use a t-shirt. Cotton's great, doesn't leave any fragments of material. And then some Q-tips. These are always helpful, disposable. Pipe cleaners work great too. They're something else you can do to kind of get those tight little spots and crevices. Really recommend a good cleaner. This CLP works well, but there's a variety of stuff out there. So go ahead and do whatever you need to do. Generally, you know, get a little messy with your cleaner. It's not a problem. You got brushes here, so you can, if you got a ton of carbon, we want to clean that receiver really well. You know, you want to get all that gunk out of there. So use what you have to get as deep in there and clean all the crevices. Helps to drive that t-shirt in there, really get as much as you can. On this Savage, it is tough to get all the way back there, but you've got plenty of brushes, you've got options there to get all these crevices. You've got your Q-tips to really get in there. This thing isn't really that dirty, surprisingly. A little bit of carbon there. So you want to clean the inside of the receiver good, okay? Then you want to clean the actual bolt itself. You can remove the firing pin. You know, take your nylon brush, clean inside there with some CLP. And then the outside of the bolt as well. Now on this one, we do have a little bit of surface rust here, you can see. So I mean, you could take your brass tip brush with some CLP on it and really go to town getting that stuff off of there. So anytime you got any sort of surface rust, it's a good idea to get rid of it. If it's just carbon, you know, you'll use your nylon brush. But generally it's a big overhaul. You know, you want to clean everything as much as you can, get rid of the carbon, anything that's going to create friction. You want it to operate and function flawlessly. You don't want to have any problems. So clean all the surface areas, all the cracks. You know, you've got your firing pin in here in this track. That would be an ideal place to keep clean. You want it to function smoothly, flawlessly. Same with your extractor. You don't want this to get gummed up. You would clean in there. You'd take your brush and clean in there as best as possible. Face of the bolt as well. All right. This is where your ejector rides here. Clean that area. You can even pull the ejector off. There's the ejector here. All right. You can even give it a nice little wipe down. Make sure you get all the gunk off of there. You can go ahead, it inserts onto the barrel like so. Okay. Just pull it off here for a second. The other thing is we're cleaning the barrel. Put some CLP down the barrel. Okay. Now we're going to run that bore snake through. That's what I love about these bore snakes. It doesn't take much. It's real simple, easy. So you just feed that 550 cord through, okay, and it comes through the other side here. And then you just pull the snake all the way through. Now the deal with the bore snake is it's actually got these little bristles here. Okay, so it's got the little metal bristles there that'll clean all that carbon and the rifling, and then it's got, you know, some nice soft material here to actually wipe it out. So it's all in one. You don't need to run a brush through and then a cleaning patch or anything like that. It's just one operation more or less. So I'd recommend just run it through a few times with some CLP, get it nice and clean depending on how filthy it is. Okay. So that's just a quick demo on what you do to clean it. Now let's put it all back together. So go ahead and grab your bolt, grab your firing pin. Want to make sure we have that in there. Insert it like so. Okay. And go ahead and slide the bolt into the receiver. All right, you want to keep charging handle hole right there in the ejection port. Drop your charging handle in first. Okay, slide it in place. Set that down. Go ahead and grab your ejector, and we're going to insert that onto the left side of the barrel. Snap right into place. Make sure it's flush. See it like so. Okay, left side. Now, go ahead and insert that into the receiver. You got to line it up. You got to get that ejector to line up. That notch there on the face of the bolt. Lines up. All goes in. Nice and smooth. All goes in nice and smooth. You want to make sure this charging handle doesn't create any sort of interference with this track here. You may have to adjust it, pulling up on it a little bit so that it'll slide smoothly down here. But you want to make sure it functions, right? And you also want to make sure we've got our little notch here. Make sure the barrel's lined up perfectly in this notch. And then we're going to take the barrel clamp, longer tab, goes into the notch. And you'll see this barrel will want to kind of slide out a little bit. So just go ahead and get it lined up, hold it in place, drop that tab right in there to lock it in place, grab the stud, just get it hand tight. And we're going to grab our wrench, torque it down, our 7/16 inch wrench. Give it a few good turns, don't strip it out. Now you want to grab your trigger assembly and go ahead and lay that in place here. Make sure the holes are all lining up. Now grab the magazine housing. I'm going to insert this tab down here. And you may have to move the trigger assembly back just a hair and then push it forward, get the holes to line up again, so that way that it's captured like so. So basically this magazine housing is sitting on top of the trigger assembly plate here. So then we'll take our stock assembly stud, insert that here. Make sure you've got the lock washer on there as well. Just kind of get it hand tight, all right? Then we're going to take the rear stud with the lock washer, insert that back here, hand tight. Just want to get those threads started. Then we'll come back and we'll tighten everything down. Now grab your Phillips head screwdriver and your magazine housing screw with the lock washer on it, and go ahead and insert that into the last remaining hole here. Go ahead and snug it down. Now go ahead and grab your flathead screwdriver and snug down those studs. Stock assembly stud first, and then the rear stud. Okay, we've got our receiver all back together, our trigger assembly back on, our magazine housing back on, barrels back connected. We're good to go. Ready to put it back in the stock now. Now we're going to go ahead and attach the stock to the receiver and barrel. Go ahead and grab your stock and slide it right over top. Trigger's in place, line up these holes. Go ahead and grab your stock assembly screws. Get them started. Now take your 5/32 Allen key, go ahead and tighten them down. Just make sure they're good and snug. Don't over tighten them. All right, nice, look at that. All blacked out down here, that looks cool. Stainless up top. Now that it's all reassembled, let's do a function check real quick. Go ahead and insert your snap cap, dummy round. Weapons on safe, pull the trigger, good. On fire, excellent. That trigger pull feels nice. Now let's see what we got for an improved trigger pull. Insert that snap cap. 3 pounds, 8.6 ounces. Now that's what I'm talking about. A good 3.5 pound trigger pull. That's what we want. Anything less than that would be a little bit dangerous. I mean, you know, 3 pounds, we're in that sweet spot. That's perfect. So really can't beat it, guys. Let's do one more just to confirm, see where we're at. 3 pounds, 9.5 ounces. There you have it, guys. Nice 3.5 pound trigger job for your Savage 64. Also works with the Savage Stevens 62, Cooey 64, Lakefield 64 Bravo, Savage 954. Thanks, guys, for watching. And as always, happy shooting.